Today we're in the book of Judges, and Judges is about reconciliation. So becomes this pattern that you start to see. You've already seen it prior to now, but it becomes like just really evident as there becomes this obedience and then disobedience. There's this deterioration of values, and then there's the deliverance from their life. From the trouble that they found themselves in. And so today we're going to look at this interesting story, and at least a portion of it, I am 100% sure I have never preached before. I feel confident. I could not find it in any of my outlines, and at this point, every outline I've ever preached from is digitized, but I feel confident I've talked about Deborah, but I haven't preached this entire chapter, and it's a very, very interesting story. And so today I want to talk to you about victorious women. Victorious women. If you were to ride with me today, you're probably not going to get a lot of music in the vehicle if I have control of the stereo. I'm usually listening to books or podcasts. And that's not something new, okay? So for years, pretty much since I was a teenager, at least by the time I was a young adult, I was listening to books on tape. And when I'd travel, and I've always spent a lot of time on the road, I would listen to books on tape. And I brought some because I know there are people in here who have no idea what a tape is. So I just went up in the attic and grabbed some. So this is what you had to carry around with you if you were going to listen to stuff. So there's stuff like from Harvey Mackay on here. There's Brian Tracy, Michael Gerber, James Van Fleet. This is John Maxwell here. And I'm just helping y'all. This is for everybody in here that's under 35. Your stuff used to come in a box like this, okay? And then you open it up, and if you don't have any idea how a pencil goes with this, okay, you're young. And I listened to hours and hours and hours of tapes and books, just self-improvement, and I still do that. I'm a firm believer that my growth matters to everybody else that's coming along on a journey with me. So I'm constantly reading. I'm constantly listening to books. I'm constantly listening to podcasts. Very little music occasionally. I've changed up my routine for music a little bit recently, but not a lot of music. As much as I love music and I'm somewhat musically inclined, I just don't listen to a lot of music. And when it came to radio, all right, if you traveled like I did, you would have a station, then you wouldn't have a station, right? All you kids who think XM has been around forever, it has not, so you would have a station, and then, you'd go 15, 20, 30 miles, and then you had to find a new station, and I had one that you had to dial, you didn't, you got one, and, you would try to fine-tune it, and so I had this Dodge 250 truck that I was using for the business, and I had a customer in the Tidewater area, Chanello's Pizza, and I would do their pizza shops, and I was living in Lumberton at the time. It was before I moved up here, so this would have been, I moved to Cresswell, the suburbs of Cresswell, in 1995, and some of y'all are like, what's he talking about? That is meant to be a joke, okay? I live 3 miles outside of Cresswell in a suburb place called Cherry. That's where I moved to. And so I moved up here in 1995. So this would have been pre-95, okay? So 92, 93, 94, somewhere in that ballpark. And I would drive from Lumberton to Tidewater area to make deliveries, and then I would drive back. Well, the big city, so Tidewater was a big city from where I was. It was one of the few places that you could pick up a religious radio station. So when I would get to that area, I would pop my tape out because you had to do that in order for the radio to come on. See, I'm speaking some of you's language. Some of you are like, what's he talking about? You know, I would have to get the cassette to come out and so I could listen to the radio. And there was a religious radio station that I would pick up somewhere on 58 between Emporia and Suffolk. I don't even remember where it was. And I would listen to it. So they would have some music, but they would have preachers and speakers. So I started listening, and there was this guy that came on about 11 o'clock every time I would be through there. And they said some interesting things, like I was interested in what they had to say. I didn't always agree with everything they said, but they were taking a different approach to Bible teaching than I'd had heard before. Well, I would listen to it as I would come in, and this would go on. I was probably up here once or twice a week for several years, and I would catch, a piece of a sermon or a piece of a lesson, and I would get out of the truck, and I never got to hear an entire program, and I never heard him say his name. And so one day I got to the area and I ended up having to wait. So I got something to eat and I was sitting in the truck, and that radio program came on, and it was on, I think it was on when it started, and it got to the end of the program, and it said, "Thank you for joining us today on Joyce Meyer's ministry." And I said, that has been a woman the whole time. I didn't have video, okay? All I had, and she's got a kind of a gravelly voice, y'all, and all I had was radio. And I was like, I thought I'd been listening to a man the whole time. Instead, I was listening to Joyce Myers, And I laughed. It's funny to me even still today that I thought that this was a man. And for me, that was like the end of, I didn't think anything else about it. I still listened, when I was in the area, I didn't think anything else about it. Now, here's what I know. Some of you in this room, immediately, if you heard woman preacher, you would have turned the radio off and never listened again. Here's what I understand, is that everybody in this room comes from some varied background, some different belief system, and we can have a lot of debate, we can have a lot of discussion about women's roles in the church, in the world, and I'm going to talk about that, So I grew up with women preachers. That was not an uncommon thing. There were some distinctions about certain things that could or could not happen, but in the Pentecostal church, women preachers were a pretty common thing, and so it wasn't an unusual thing. And what I understand is that some churches, all right, there are two ends of the spectrum. There are some churches that they exclude women from everything, period. Like that's just the end of the conversation. Women do nothing. And then the other end of the spectrum is there is completely no difference, and they see everybody as the same in every role. And so I'm going to speak for myself this morning as I lead into this sermon to lay out a couple of things. And I want to say up front that I'm speaking for myself more than anything else. But we have lots of conversations around this from time to time. There are some things I can point to specifically and say, this is what it says. There are other things I can point to and say, yeah, I'm not sure about that. And I'm pretty open that I can't point to certain things. So the goal of what I've got to say today is more important than what I'm going to talk about to introduce the sermon. I just feel the need to kind of lay a couple of things out as we begin the sermon. First of all, in the church, when you get to the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, you find what we would call the fivefold ministry of the church, or some people might call it fourfold and group two of them together. So you would have apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Some people would group pastors and teachers together and tell you there were only four callings or four of those ministries in the church. Of that group, there's a couple of things I want to address. So my personal opinion is that those five things are callings, not offices of the church. They're callings. This is something God decides. We don't get to decide. And I can point to multiple reasons for that in Scripture. They didn't take a vote on apostles. They didn't take a vote on evangelists. They didn't take a vote on prophets. They didn't take a vote on teachers that we can find. They didn't take a vote on pastors that we can find. They just didn't. They were not offices of the church. They were callings of the church. In both the Old and New Testament, you can find women prophets. Okay, so Deborah, we're going to talk about today, is a prophetess. The Bible calls her that. When you get to the book of Acts, you find that Philip has 4 daughters. All 4 of them are prophetesses. You find women prophets in the Old Testament, and you find women prophets in the New Testament. We don't really find people who have the title of evangelists, but we do find evangelism being very specifically carried out in the New Testament. And so, there are a couple of examples I could point to. So the first people to go and tell that Jesus was risen from the dead were women. That's right. They were the women. That was who were told the message and said, go evangelize. The woman at the well whom Jesus taught went back to her town and evangelized. Say, come and see a man. She was an evangelist for Jesus. She went and told the town, come and see. So it's clear in both the Old Testament and New Testament. We have prophetesses. It's clear in the Old Testament and New Testament. We have women evangelists. When you get to the other roles, it's not as clear, okay? The other callings, as I would say. There are some exceptions that I would point to. For example, Priscilla and Aquila. And Aquila is the man in that conversation, by the way. Almost every time they're mentioned, her name is mentioned first, and order, we talked about this a few weeks ago, order in the Bible matters. And her name coming first, which is almost never in the Bible, would indicate that she had more prominence. And it tells us that Apollos, when he came to Christ, that they took him, Priscilla and Aquila, that's how it says, took him into their home and taught him the way of Christ. So they were his teachers. Apollos becomes this famous preacher in the New Testament, and there becomes this tension between he and Paul in the Scriptures. So that it's not as clear as we want it to be, but clearly she has some prominent role in the church, and part of that prominent role is to teach a pastor or an evangelist the way of Jesus, and how, because he came through and he was over exuberant. That's what's going on. He's preaching the gospel. He's a little bit, out there, and they're like, okay, let's bring him in and let's teach him the way he should do it and the way he shouldn't do it. Now, there are a couple of offices in the church, and this is where more of the tension arises in some places. So we have deacons. That would be an office of the church. Those are specifically chosen by the people of God to serve the people of God. There are qualifications laid out for deacons. In 1 Timothy, there would be qualifications for deacons and elders in Timothy and in Titus. But what I always look for, okay, if you have this, is there an exception? All right. Is there an exception? So in the book of Romans in the New Testament, we find Phoebe, who is a deaconess. Some translations say servant. Other translations say deaconess. But it is the same word translated deacon. Okay, it's not a different word. It's not this word is deacon and that word is servant. It's the same word translated servant. So we find women deacons in the New Testament, at least in the role of Phoebe, clearly that she is present there. Now, some of you will disagree with everything I've said so far. Some of you will agree with everything I've said so far. Now, let me say, the second office of the church, okay, is the role of elder, bishop, overseer. That one's not as clear, okay? Now, you can argue with me if you want to. This is just me talking, all right? I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for anybody else. I'm speaking for myself. This is the place where I find attention in this role. Because what I look for is, okay, what does the Bible say, and are there any exceptions to the rule? And I can't, for that role, elder, overseer, bishop, I can't find an exception. I'm not telling you wrong if you see it differently than I do. I can't, it's not there for me. And the way I read the Bible, I have to find some clarity, and I have to be there. And so some of you are like, well, I don't like that. And you're over in this area. And that's perfectly fine. I have no problem with that. Some of you think I'm the greatest liberal that's ever stepped on this stage and I just went way too far. And that's perfectly fine. You'll get over it. And the truth is you have to read the Bible and you have to understand what it says and you have to say, okay, does it say this here? And is there an exception to it? And how do we measure it? And what does it mean? Now, here's the thing I want to say. We can have a lot of debate about offices and roles of women in the Bible and in the church and what it should be and what it shouldn't be. We can try to make distinctions and draw lines. Here's the thing that I really want to drive home today, and this is probably the most important thing for us to leave with. We can disagree about a lot of things, but the thing we cannot disagree with is that there are some significant women leaders in Scripture, and there are some significant women leaders in the world. And I'm just going to be straight up with you. In the church I grew up in, if it weren't for women, we wouldn't have had a church. It was 70-30, and by the way, statistically, it's 70-30 in churches, 70% women, 30% men, and at least half of that 30% of men are only there because their wife made them. Some of y'all are like, yep, that's why I'm here, preacher. And so it's significant, and we have to recognize that. And so today, we're going to look at two women. When you think of the story of Deborah, you really only think of one woman. There's two women in this story. I'm spilling water all over myself. And we're going to look at this. And this is an opportunity for me to say this. The first Saturday in March, we have a women's conference here. It's a great opportunity for women to come together and recognize their gifts and talk and encourage one another. And if you're not signed up, I encourage you to sign up. They have a wonderful time together. You saw a video from Martha Fry. Her and Matt are both going to be here. Matt's one of our overseers here at the church. He pastors a church in Clayton, and you will enjoy both of them if you possibly can come. I would just encourage you to come and be a part of that as like-minded women come together to honor the Savior and to lift him up and to talk about what Jesus means in their life. But there are some characteristics today that I want to point out to you about women. And I want to share from this story, and I want to share from my personal experience as I talk about victorious women. Here's the first thing. Women lead. You can go through the Bible. There are a couple of books named after women. You have Ruth, you have Esther, and it was their leadership that had a significant impact on the people of Israel. There are very few women that get mentioned in the New Testament from the Old Testament, and it's odd that the ones that get chosen, but we get Bathsheba mentioned in Matthew, we get Ruth mentioned in Matthew, we get Rahab mentioned in Matthew. There may be one more woman, but those are the three, and they have some unusual characteristics, but the characteristics that you can put, like with Ruth and Esther, is their leadership had a significant impact on the people that followed around them. I mentioned that God chose women at the tomb to be the first and go and tell his message. And if you want my honest opinion, that is one of the reasons why the Bible is so authentic. Because if they were trying to get the opinions of the people around there to match the current culture, they would have said it was men, because women weren't well received in that culture. But God chose women to be the ones to go and first tell the story, the woman at the well. And listen, we can even find bad leadership among women, because Jezebel would be an example. We joke, we did a podcast recently on Jezebel, and I don't remember if it ended up on the podcast or it was pre-podcast. I grew up believing that Jezebel was a bad person because she wore a lot of eyeshadow. I did. Like if in the church environment I grew up in, if somebody said you're a Jezebel, it was because they wore a lot of makeup. Anybody else? Any other? I see at least a couple of you. Don't be afraid. Nobody's ashamed that you got raised like I did. Exactly. That's if you were called a Jezebel. Well, Jezebel's problem wasn't her eyeshadow. I just want to be clear. There's a piece of the story that makes it that way, okay? But that's not her problem. It was just she was a leader. She was pretty much the one in charge, and she was an evil, corrupt person that did a lot of bad things, and Ahab just kind of followed along and did whatever she said. So we have good leaders and we have bad leaders. But this is what it says here. It says, after Ehud's death. Ehud's a story. So Ehud came in and killed the king. Do y'all remember that story? He was left-handed. And he hit a sword, and he pulled the sword out with his left hand, and he stabbed him, and the king was so fat that the sword disappeared. Y'all remember that story? Okay. Some of you do. Yeah, like that's one of those funny stories. So that's what I remember most about Ehud, is he was left-handed, and he killed the fat king. You got to remember the Bible somehow. Anyway, it says, after Ehud's death, the Israelites again did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord turned them over to King Jabin of Hazor, a Canaanite king. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived at Harosheth Haggayim. Sisera, who had 900 iron chariots, ruthlessly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth, was a prophet who was judging Israel at that time. So there's two things you need to notice here. She is the only woman judge listed in the book of Judges. So some other judges would have been Samuel. He's the most famous one because he has 2 books of the Bible named after him. He's also the last judge, by the way, before they get a king. Gideon would have been a judge. Samson would have been a judge. So there's a long line of judges. She's the only woman judge that we find. And it says something interesting about her. She was also a prophetess, which I would say probably also meant she was a priest, because those roles were combined. That's what Samuel was. That's what Gideon becomes. He's the one that offers the sacrifices for the people. So the judges were kind of a transition, that's how we would describe it, from Joshua, who was like the leader, to kings, who the first one becomes Saul. So they become the people who lead Israel. They're also usually warriors. But it says she was a prophetess or a prophet, and she was a judge, okay? She would sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would go out to her for judgment. So when they needed advice, when they needed somebody to make a decision, when they needed a judge, Deborah was the one. She was the place that they would go, just like they would go to Samuel when they needed something, just like they would go to Samson or Gideon or any of the other judges. Deborah was the one that they went to find. And she would prophesy for them. She would judge for them. She would give them the direction that they needed as a people. By the way, the word Deborah means honeybee. I did not know that actually until the last 24 hours. I thought it was interesting. It says, so she would sit there and the Israelites would go to her for judgment. One day she sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, who lived in Kadesh in the land of Naphtali. She said to him, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Call out 10,000 warriors from the tribe of Naphtali and Zebulun at Mount Tabor, and I will call out Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, along with the chariots and warriors to the Kishon River. There I will give you victory. So she is leading the children of Israel. She is the first, maybe, female leader for the children of Israel. That's what the judge would have been during that time. She gave them the advice. She offered them the word of God. When they needed a word from the Lord, that's where they went, was to her. And she was the one leading the children of Israel. And so she calls for the commander of the army, and she says, this is what the Lord has told me. You go out, you get your men, and I'm going to call out Sisera, and there I'm going to give you the victory. She tells him exactly what is going to happen. God gave, God gave some specific instructions for military armament at that particular time, and how they would fight, how many they needed to fight with, and who they were going to fight. And my experience is, in my life, is that there have been some significant women God has placed in my life that were strong leaders that led in situations that they were uniquely qualified to lead in. And we can have a debate about roles and offices. I want to say this, and you can take it or leave it. But disqualifying women because they are women usually opens the door for weak or corrupt men to lead. I'll say it again. Disqualifying women just because they're women usually leads or often leads to weak or corrupt men filling a role that they have no business being in. I'm just telling you where I'm coming from. I would rather have a godly woman leader than a weak, corrupt man. That's just where I'm at. I would rather have a godly woman in leadership than to have a weak, corrupt man. And one of the reasons why that happens in the church, in the country, in the world, is because we say, well, it's got to be this, and we would rather have that than to have godliness. And I see that happening in this story. She is the only one. We can have that conversation. Is it an exception and not a rule? We can have that conversation. Here's what I am going to tell you. It is clear that she is the one that was chosen to lead Israel at this time. My experience is that God raises up significant women at significant times to do significant things. And we can't ignore it. Here's the second thing. Women instill courage. I've said this before from this stage. But my wife's opinion matters more than all of yours put together. If I stand at the back and y'all all come by and say, that was a great sermon, great sermon, great sermon, and she says, you bombed today. And she's never said it exactly like that. That is going to carry more weight with me than anything else. But when she offers me encouragement, the whole world can be against me. I can't tell you the number of men who have said, my wife instills courage in me. I can't count the times that I've walked in this room and all hell was breaking loose. Everything that could be wrong was going wrong. And I'd come in during the second song and stand over here, and she would reach her hand over and start praying for me. Suddenly, I feel like I can change the world. Suddenly, everything that doesn't seem right. And if you're a man in this room, you, I believe, will agree with me that there are some things that you have only accomplished in your life because your wife said you can do it. Your spouse said you are strong enough. You can make that happen. They were your encourager. Women will instill courage in people that they cannot get on their own. If she believes I can do it, I will break myself attempting it. It says this, it says, Barak told her, I will go, but only if you go with me. He's not the first man to hide behind a woman. Adam did that. Right? Go read the first 3 chapters. It starts a pattern. She did it. She told me to do it, and I did it. He's blaming her. Here he says, I'll go, but I'll only go if you go. She says, very well. I will go with you, but you will receive no honor in this venture, for the Lord's victory over Sisera will be at the hands of a woman. And automatically, if you know the story, you know how this ends. Automatically, you think the woman's going to be who? Deborah. Like you think Deborah is going to be the one that gets the honor and gets the victory. She's not. Another woman's going to enter this story in just a few minutes, and we'll see that. A woman you don't want to be your wife is what I would tell you. You'll understand that when we get there. I'm just kidding. So Deborah went out with Barak to Kadesh. At Kadesh, Barak called together the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 warriors went up with him. Deborah also went with him. Now Heber the Kenite, a descendant of Moses' brother-in-law Hobab, had moved away from the other members of his tribe and pitched his tent by the oak of Zananim near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, he called for all 900 of his iron chariots and all his warriors, and they marched from Harosheth Haggayim. This story is about women and hard words. That's the two things you're going to take away today. And to the Kishon River. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Get ready. This is the day the Lord will give you victory over Sisera, for the Lord is marching ahead of you." See what she's doing? She's instilling courage in him. She's telling him, you've got this. This is what God's going to do. When I come in this room and life has been difficult and she reaches over and prays for me, that's what she's praying. The Lord's ahead of you. He's got this. You just go out, do your part, but the Lord's got it. She's instilling courage for him. She prays for me on a regular basis. She'll just walk up to me when she knows that there's a difficult choice to make, or I've got difficult decisions ahead of me. She'll just walk up, put her arms around me, and she'll start praying in my ear. The courage that instills in me to know that my wife is calling on a God for me on my behalf to do things that I cannot do for myself. That's what's happening here. Deborah says, go, God's going to give it to you. So Barak led his 10,000 warriors down the slope of Mount Tabor in the battle. When Barak attacked, the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and warriors into a panic. Sisera leaped down from his chariot and escaped on foot. Then Barak chased the chariots and the enemy army all the way to Harosheth Haggayim, killing all of Sisera's warriors. Not a single one was left alive. After 20 years of oppression, after 20 years of being bullied and beat around, then one day he kills them all at the hand of the Lord. Barak, listen, had courage, but he did not have courage without Deborah. And I know we can get overly spiritual here and we can talk this if we want to, but I got to be honest with you. There's never been a day in my life I doubted God was on my side. I've never doubted God was existing. I never doubted the power of God. But there have been moments where I was so fearful or frustrated or overwhelmed or distraught that somebody else's faith in me, instilled in me, encouraged me to be able to lead. And that's what I find in people around me. And I'll be honest with you, growing up, I found this more from women than I did from men. Now, I want to say Lord, I didn't plan to go here, but I'm going here. One of the reasons I heard that more from women than I did from men is because men don't know how to say blessings over people. We struggle to compliment. We struggle to say positive things. We're just like fist bump. and they're supposed to read everything out of that, But women, they're praying, they're loud, they're encouraging, they're speaking. And growing up, it was women who were constantly encouraging me when I was young to walk right, to talk right. They're the ones that taught me in Sunday school most of the time. Like they were the ones who were most active in the youth groups that I grew up in. They were the ones that were offering the encouragement. Like when I first went in the ministry, I don't recall a single man other than my dad offering me verbal encouragement. But there were lots of the women in the church who were giving spiritual encouragement. I want to say two things. One, to every woman that has ever offered encouragement to somebody in their spiritual walk, thank you. To the men in this room, open your mouth, because we can make a difference if we'll just tell people the things God wants to do in their life. That's what I would say. Women instill courage. The faith of women instills courage in men. It is not, I bet this is, if I ask for you to raise your hand, I bet there would be a majority. It's not uncommon for women to have the most faith in the relationship. And I don't mean more saved. I just mean the most faith. Here's the last part. Women finish. Our staff is working through a book called The Working Genius by Patrick Lencioni. There's this assessment that comes from it, and the assessment tells you that everybody has two working geniuses. There's 6 of them, by the way, and everybody has 2 working frustrations. So there are things like you love to do, it's easy for you to do, you can make it happen. It's like it's in your wheelhouse. So mine are ideation and galvanizing, meaning I can come up with ideas and I can find people to do them, okay? My 2 frustrations are enablement, which means I see you doing something and I'm going to come along and help you, and tenacity, meaning I'm there at the end. Those are my frustrations. I'm not, I've been saying that for years, not in those terms, but by the time, you've heard me say this before, by the time we finish a project, I'm at the next 4, okay? They're putting up the LED wall this week, and I'm out in the hallway coming up with more ideas and frustrating everybody around me who's trying to finish this one, because I got other things that I want to accomplish, because that's just how I think. My wife is the exact opposite. So her two working geniuses are tenacity, meaning she finishes things, and enablement, meaning if she sees somebody doing something, her natural thought is, can I help you? And so all of these things, so we're going through this as a staff. And the interesting thing that I notice is that when it comes to finishing, the tenacity is the willing to push through that last 10% and finish. Tenacity in our church, in our leadership team, the overwhelming majority who it is their genius are women, and the overwhelming majority who it is their frustration are men. Let me speak to you women. How many unfinished projects does your husband have around the house? I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm just asking, how many he's like, I'm going to start this, and he loses interest. He goes start something else, and you got 14 stereos torn apart in the garage, right? Now I understand that that's not true across the board. I just understand that's just typical, but because women finish. My wife will walk in a house and I will jam a schedule, okay? And so tomorrow she's going to get a break, okay? Because we had marriage conference for 2 days. When we finished that, we had a dinner appointment in Williamston with my family. So we went to that last night. We got home late. Today we'll come to church. We'll leave church. We'll go get on an airplane to go to a conference on the West Coast. And so tomorrow she gets a free day, because even when we come in late, so if we walk in the house and it's midnight, if there are dishes in the sink, guess what she's got to do? She's got to wash those dishes before she can sleep, because it's got to be done. Everything's got to be put away. I'm like, can we just go to bed? right? You know, can we fold the blanket tomorrow? Can we pick up the pillows the next day? Nope, we got to finish. That's just how she's made. And I would tell you that is my experience, that they are strong finishers. This is what it says. It says, meanwhile, Sisera ran to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because Heber's family was on friendly terms with King Jabin of Hazor. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come into my tent, sir. Come in. Don't be afraid. Liar. So he went into her tent and she covered him with a blanket. Motherly, right? He says, please give me some water. He said, I'm thirsty. So she gave him some milk from a leather bag and covered him again. Motherly, right? Stand at the door of the tent, he told her. If anybody comes and asks you if there is anyone here, say no. But when Sisera fell asleep from exhaustion, Jael quietly crept up to him with a hammer and a tent peg in her hand. Some of y'all didn't know these two stories went together, did you? It says, then she drove the tent peg through his temple and into the ground. This is anticlimactic. And so he died. Like, what else was going to happen? It says, when Barak came looking for Sisera, Jael went out to meet him, and she said, come and I will show you the man you are looking for. So he followed her into the tent and found Sisera lying there dead with a tent peg through his temple. So on that day, Israel saw God defeat Jabin, the Canaanite king. And from that time on, Israel became stronger and stronger against King Jabin until they finally destroyed him. A couple of things I want to point out to you. First of all, Jael would have been a part of a group that would have been nomads. We're told about them, if you notice, that group of people at the beginning of the chapter. They would have moved from place to place in tents. God, this is the beauty of God. God, for years, had been training her for this job as they pull up tent and put down tent. Driving those tent pegs. There was not one day. Now, she might have thought, boy, I'd like to get my husband one day, but it doesn't say that. She might have thought it when she was driving tent pegs. I doubt she thought, one day I'm going to kill the leader of the enemy army. I doubt that ever crossed her mind, but she's out there practicing driving pegs. And then one day God put the enemy in her tent, and she used what she had been practicing for years to do exactly what God had called her to do. And the thing I want to say to some of you right now is you're out there driving tent pegs and you're like, this is useless. I could be doing something better. I could be doing something more important. I could be doing something that's a lot more elevated. And God's just setting you up so that when the opportunity shows up with one swoop, because y'all understand that, right? She didn't get it started. You know how you do with a nail, you tap it a little bit and you get it started and then you can whack it. She didn't do that on his temple. Y'all understand that, right? She didn't go wham. No, you can't. He would have woke up in one strike. That's a bad woman. I'm telling y'all right now, like, I love my wife, but if I ever see her with a tent spike and a hammer, I'm leaving. Right? In one strike. The reason why she was able to kill him with a spike and a hammer is because God had her doing a job that seemed insignificant until he gave her a job that was extremely significant. Don't underestimate the training that God is putting you through right now. You feel like it's a waste, it's tiring, but I believe that God in his infinite wisdom sees further down the road than we could ever see. And listen, we can debate what the Bible has to say, but we cannot discount the way that women were used in Scripture and the way God uses them today in the world. And I believe one of the things that makes the church great is because we have victorious women. And I pray that God continues. I don't really want any tent peg drivers right this minute, but I am looking for some people who God uses in the roles that God has called you to do, that raises you up to be strong and victorious. Probably the place that I see this most often where you feel like it's monotonous is when you have kids. This is true of both parents. You're like, golly, I'm sick of this. Right? The one snicker and probably have teenagers. It's tiring. You feel like, what's the point? I'm a terrible parent. This ain't working. But you don't realize how God's using you right now for a work that's going to be greater than anything you could ever imagine. My encouragement to you is to allow the roles that God has placed you in to be used of Him ever how He chooses. And don't be so caught up in this is the way it always was, or this is the way it has been, or this is the way it used to be, and allow God to work in the way He wants to work, because victory comes when God's at work, not when we are. That's the most important thing. I'm going to ask you to stand today. You're going to be served communion here in just a few moments. Kent's coming to lead a song. We're going to sing together and worship. If you're on the prayer team, I'm going to ask you to come on down front. If today you're in a battle, a struggle, a fight, a wrestling match that you need the victory over, maybe you have a situation that has oppressed you for years and you want God to help deliver you, you will need faith in Him to be able to do that. If there's anything you would like prayer for or about, we would like to pray with you. There's people across the front. I'll be down front. If you just want to come pray by yourself, that's perfectly fine. For the rest of us, we're going to sing and worship. And if you're in this room today and you don't know Christ as your Lord and Savior, this would be the day to come and know Him. Let's sing together. Let's worship together. Let's pray together.